This story is about Sophie, a 74-year-old mother who has spent her entire life caring for her family, and now she faces betrayal from her own son, Daniel, and daughter-in-law, Laura. During Christmas, when Sophie receives a cold rejection from Laura, she realizes that she is no longer a part of the family. After a deep emotional shock, Sophie decides to take back control of her life, including the house she and her late husband built. She changes her will, deciding not to leave the house to Daniel anymore. Sophie faces resistance from her son and daughter-in-law, and after a long legal battle, she ultimately triumphs. However, the victory is not the most important thing. What Sophie learns is the importance of finding herself again and making her own decisions, no longer being pressured by others. In the end, Sophie begins to open her heart to her family and finds a small reconciliation with her son Daniel, starting out with slow steps toward rebuilding trust. The final lesson of the story is about self-respect, resilience, and not allowing yourself to be cast aside, even when faced with betrayal from those closest to you. Thank you for reading. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so you won't miss out on more heartfelt and inspiring stories. Your support means so much. Sophie had always believed that Christmas was a time for family and love, a season where the world felt warm and full of hope. But that year, something shattered her peaceful belief. It wasn't the cold of winter that left her heart frozen, but the cruel words from her daughter-in-law, Laura. Sophie, at 74, had always lived a quiet life in her little house by the sea, surrounded by the waves and the memories of her late husband. A simple life, yes, but one filled with peace and purpose. When her son Daniel invited her to spend the holidays with them, she never imagined that it would end in such an unexpected way. Laura, from a wealthy family, had made it clear that Sophie no longer fit into their world, a world of luxury and expectations. Sophie never thought she would feel like an outsider in her own family, but Laura's dismissive words made it painfully clear. Her own son Daniel stood silent, and just like that, Sophie was left out in the cold, alone. But what happens when you've been pushed too far? When you're broken, but find the strength to rise again? This is Sophie's story. Christmas had always been a time of togetherness for Sophie. The memories of decorating the tree with her late husband, the laughter of family filling their little home, and the warmth of shared meals seemed like distant echoes now. She had never expected a Christmas like this. Alone, abandoned by her own son, whose voice, once full of love and promise, now felt like a distant memory. When Daniel had first suggested she join them for the holidays, Sophie had hesitated. After all, she was just a simple woman, accustomed to the quiet life by the sea. But she believed in family, in the strength of their bond. Daniel, her son, was the light of her life. She had raised him, loved him, sacrificed so much for him. Surely, he wouldn't turn away from her, especially not at Christmas. But when the invitation to join his family was followed by the sharp sting of Laura's words, Sophie felt a coldness seep into her bones that nothing could warm. "You just don't fit in with my family, Sophie," Laura had said, her words laced with disdain. "You're too old, too simple. It's just not the right setting for you." Those words cut deeper than any winter chill. Sophie had spent her life supporting Daniel, had given him everything. But in that moment, she realized how little he valued her, how little he cared. The silence in her heart was louder than any noise could ever be. And in that silence, Sophie made a decision. That night, as the house grew quiet and the weight of the world pressed down on her, Sophie didn't cry. She refused to. She spent the evening alone with her thoughts, surrounded by the familiar quiet of her home by the sea. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore usually comforted her, but now it seemed distant, as if even the ocean was mourning with her. The sting of Laura's words echoed in her mind, and Sophie couldn't shake the image of Daniel standing there, silent and passive, his eyes avoiding hers. She had always known that Laura didn't like her, but she had never imagined it would go this far. To be cast aside so easily, to be treated like an inconvenience, it was too much to bear. As she sat in her living room, staring at the empty chair across from her, Sophie tried to find peace in the things she had always loved. Her 2 cats, who had always been her companions, wandered around her feet, unaware of the heavy emotions that clouded the room. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself with memories or small tasks, the truth was undeniable. She had been abandoned. Her own son had chosen his wife over her, and she was left to face the holiday season alone. It wasn't until later that evening that something shifted. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Sophie wasn't expecting any calls, but when she saw Margaret's name on the screen, she felt a small flicker of hope. Margaret had been her friend for years, someone who had shared both her joys and sorrows. "Sophie," Margaret's voice was warm, comforting, and full of concern. "We're coming over. Don't you dare sit there alone. We'll bring Christmas to you." And they did. Margaret, along with a few other old friends, arrived that night with food, laughter, and company, things Sophie hadn't realized she needed so desperately. As they gathered around the table, Sophie found herself sharing the story of the house by the sea, the one she had built with her late husband. It was meant to be a gift for Daniel, a legacy to pass on to him. But as the evening wore on, surrounded by friends who truly cared about her, Sophie began to question everything. Maybe Daniel didn't deserve the house. Maybe he didn't deserve anything from her anymore. And as Anna, one of her oldest friends, looked at her with kind eyes, she spoke words that struck Sophie deeply. "Sophie, you've earned that house. You don't owe them anything, especially not after the way they treated you." For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt a spark of clarity. She realized that the house wasn't just a gift, it was her legacy, her symbol of strength. It wasn't something that should be taken away because of someone else's cruelty. She had spent her life building that life alongside her late husband. It was hers, and now it was time to take control of it. The decision to change her will was made that night, and with it came a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. The decision to change the will wasn't easy. Sophie had spent years telling herself that the house, the one thing she and her late husband had worked so hard for, should be passed on to Daniel. It was his legacy too, but after everything that had happened, the harsh words from Laura, the coldness from Daniel, it felt wrong. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming something she had lost, her dignity, her sense of self. For so long, Sophie had allowed herself to be the silent observer in her family, giving and giving, but never asking for anything in return. But now, she was done. She wasn't going to be invisible any longer. That night, after her friends left, Sophie sat at her desk, looking at the will she had written years ago. The ink on the paper seemed to mock her. It was a document that no longer reflected who she was or what she deserved. She thought about all the years she had spent as a mother, a wife, and a caregiver, all the sacrifices she had made, and yet, in one moment, everything had been stripped away from her. Laura's cruel words, Daniel's silence, it was enough. The pen in her hand trembled slightly as she crossed out Daniel's name, the name of the son she had raised, the one she had loved so deeply. The house by the sea, once intended to be his, would no longer be a part of his inheritance. Sophie wasn't ready to let him have it, not after everything he had taken from her, not after everything he had allowed Laura to take from her. The house was hers, and she was going to keep it. Sophie's decision wasn't about revenge, at least not entirely. It was about reclaiming her life, her sense of power, and her place in the world. She had given so much to her family, and now it was time to give something back to herself. She folded the will carefully and placed it in the drawer. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about making a stand. It was the beginning of something new for Sophie, something she hadn't expected, but something she was ready to face head on. The following days were quiet, but in the silence, Sophie found a new resolve. She had made her choice, and though she wasn't sure how Daniel or Laura would respond, she knew one thing. She was no longer the passive observer in her own life. She was going to fight for what was rightfully hers, and she couldn't wait to see what would happen next. Sophie spent the days after changing the will in a state of uneasy calm. She didn't hear from Daniel or Laura. The silence was both a comfort and a looming threat. She wasn't sure when or how they would find out about the change, but she knew they would, and when they did, it would be a confrontation. It was only a matter of time. The days felt longer now, filled with a quiet intensity. Sophie moved through her routine, keeping busy with her 2 cats, taking walks along the beach, and organizing old memories. But the weight of what she had done, of what she had taken from her son, hung over her like a storm cloud. She had to remind herself that this wasn't just about the house. It was about regaining control, about protecting her dignity. Then, one morning, the phone rang. Sophie knew before she even picked it up that it was her lawyer, Thomas. The conversation she'd been dreading was finally happening. She took a deep breath and answered the call. Thomas's voice was uneasy, much different from the calm professionalism Sophie had always relied on. "Sophie, we need to talk," he said, his words slow and measured. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on, Thomas?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel the tension building in her chest. There was a long pause before Thomas finally spoke. "There's a new clause in the will, Sophie," he said, his voice tight. "I think we need to review the document again. It's different from what we discussed." Sophie's mind raced. She could already feel the walls closing in. Had Daniel found a way to manipulate Thomas? Had he bribed him into changing the will behind her back? She could feel the bile rise in her throat as she thought of the possibility. "What do you mean by different, Thomas?" she asked, her voice hardening. "I think we need to meet in person," Thomas replied. "I'm not sure what happened, but I'm afraid something has changed. It's about the estate, Sophie. It's about the house by the sea." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. Sophie wasn't sure how or why, but it was clear that Daniel had found a way to manipulate the situation again. He was trying to take back what was rightfully hers. Without thinking, Sophie hung up the phone, grabbed her coat, and left the house, determined to confront whatever had happened. She wasn't going to let Daniel win this time, not again. When Sophie arrived at Thomas's office, the air was thick with tension. Thomas, the man she had trusted, stood there, visibly uncomfortable. He led her to his office, where they sat across from each other. Sophie could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't the man she had once relied on. This was someone who had been swayed by her son's influence. "Sophie," Thomas began, his voice shaking slightly, "I should have questioned Daniel more. I've made mistakes, and now I don't know how to make it right." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cold and unwavering. "Daniel came to me," Thomas admitted, his head hanging low. "He insisted that the changes in the will were what you wanted. He said you were getting forgetful, that it would be easier if I made the changes, and I didn't question it. I should have, but I didn't." Sophie's anger surged. "So you let him manipulate you into changing my will without my consent? Without even asking me?" Thomas looked at her, guilt written across his face. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I should have known better. He kept telling me it was what you wanted. He said he was helping you, but now I see how wrong I was." Sophie's heart pounded. She felt a deep sense of betrayal. "How much did he pay you to do this?" she asked, her voice cutting. Thomas stammered. "No, Sophie, it wasn't about money. He didn't pay me, but he kept insisting that it was what you wanted, that the house should go to him, that it was your wishes." Sophie stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back. "I trusted you, Thomas," she said, her voice shaking with anger, "and now you've betrayed me too." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Thomas standing there, his head hung low in shame. As Sophie walked back to her car, the realization hit her with full force. Her son had been scheming behind her back. But this time, Sophie wasn't going to back down. She had already made her decision, and she wasn't going to let Daniel take away what was hers. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to lose. Not now, not ever. The days following her confrontation with Thomas were a blur of anger and determination. Sophie knew that her son Daniel had crossed a line. He had betrayed her trust in a way that was almost unimaginable. Yet it wasn't just Daniel's actions that filled Sophie with rage. It was the fact that he had manipulated someone she had relied on for years, someone who was supposed to protect her interests. The betrayal ran deeper than she had ever anticipated, and she could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest every time she walked through her front door. But Sophie wasn't a woman to be defeated so easily. She had always prided herself on her independence, and now, with the anger burning in her heart, she knew she had to take action. She wasn't going to let Daniel and Laura take away everything she had worked for. The house was hers, and she was determined to keep it. She reached out to a new lawyer, someone young and eager who could help her take the next steps. His name was Richard, and Sophie could sense his determination the moment they sat down in his office. Unlike Thomas, Richard wasn't hesitant. He wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right, and for the first time since her world had been turned upside down, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could still fight for what she deserved. Richard listened intently as Sophie told him everything that had happened, the manipulations, the betrayals, the heartbreak. As she spoke, she could feel the floodgates open. She had kept so much of her pain bottled up for so long, but now, with Richard's calm presence, she was finally able to voice it all, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just a victim of her circumstances. She was someone who had the power to fight back. "We'll take this to court, Sophie," Richard said, his voice confident. "You have a strong case. If your son wants to fight, we'll fight, but we'll do it the right way." Sophie nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had a lawyer she could trust, someone who was on her side, and that made all the difference. Over the next few days, Sophie met with Richard several more times, gathering the documents and evidence needed to make her case. Each meeting brought a new sense of clarity, a new understanding of what was at stake. It wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her right to stand up for herself. But as the court date loomed closer, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Daniel and Laura hadn't contacted her again, but Sophie knew they were planning something. They had already proven that they were willing to fight dirty to get what they wanted, and Sophie was ready to face whatever came her way. One afternoon, as Sophie sat by the fire in her living room, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led to this point. The pain of being cast aside by her own son was still fresh in her heart, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let him get away with it. This wasn't just about the house. It was about showing him that she wasn't someone to be ignored. She wasn't just Sophie, the quiet mother by the sea. She was a woman who had fought for everything she had, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Sophie stood before the mirror adjusting her jacket. The weight of the battle ahead pressed on her chest, but her resolve was unshakable. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving to herself and to Daniel that she was not someone to be pushed aside. The courthouse was cold, its marble floors echoing beneath Sophie's steps as she walked into the courtroom. Richard was by her side, offering a reassuring smile. Sophie appreciated his support, but she knew that this battle was hers to fight. When Daniel and Laura walked in, Sophie's heart skipped a beat. They looked different. Their faces were tight with anger and frustration, but there was something else in their eyes. They knew the fight wasn't over, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie realized something. She wasn't the only one who had changed. They had underestimated her, and now they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The judge called the hearing to order, and Sophie listened as Richard presented their case. He spoke calmly, presenting the evidence of Daniel's manipulations, the changes made to the will without Sophie's consent. Sophie could feel her anger rise as she heard the facts laid bare, but she didn't flinch. This was her moment. She wasn't going to let them take away her life, her home, not without a fight. When it was Sophie's turn to speak, she stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. She faced Daniel and Laura across the room, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and contempt. But Sophie didn't look away. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had fought for her son, for her family, for so long. Now, it was time to fight for herself. "I never expected this," Sophie began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I never expected my own son to try to take something that wasn't his. Something I worked my whole life for, but more than that, I didn't expect him to throw me away, to treat me like I didn't matter." Daniel shifted in his seat, but he didn't speak. Laura, however, scoffed and crossed her arms as if she couldn't care less about what Sophie had to say. "This house," Sophie continued, her voice growing stronger, "is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a symbol of everything my husband and I worked for, and I won't let anyone take it from me, not like this." The courtroom fell silent. Sophie had said what needed to be said. Now, she would wait for the judge's decision. As Richard stood by her side, she felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She had done what she had to do. Now, the battle was in the hands of the court. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as Sophie stood tall, her words lingering in the air. She had laid bare her pain, her heartbreak, and her resolve. The judge sat silently, taking in the testimonies, the facts, and the emotional weight of the case. For a moment, Sophie's mind wandered back to the years she had spent raising Daniel, to the sacrifices she had made for him and his future. How had it come to this? How had her son, the child she had loved so deeply, turned his back on her so easily? But Sophie refused to dwell on the pain anymore. This was not the time for self-pity. The time for standing up for herself had come. She was done being the quiet, invisible mother in the background. The woman who had been dismissed was no longer willing to remain silent. As the judge reviewed the evidence, Sophie's eyes flicked toward Daniel and Laura. They were still sitting together, their faces rigid with anger and frustration. Daniel, who had once been her little boy, now sat there as a man whose only concern seemed to be the house, the property that Sophie had worked so hard for. His eyes avoided hers, as if he couldn't bear the weight of the truth. Laura, on the other hand, sat with her arms crossed, her expression condescending. Sophie knew that Laura had never liked her, but what hurt the most was seeing how easily Laura had convinced Daniel to turn against her. In that moment, Sophie realized just how much influence Laura had over him and how much that influence had cost her. But Sophie wasn't about to let Laura dictate her life any longer. She had loved Daniel, had given him everything, but now she saw him for who he had become, a man willing to betray his own mother for a house. It was a bitter realization, but one that Sophie could no longer ignore. As the judge continued his deliberation, Sophie felt a strange calm wash over her. She had done everything she could. She had stood up for herself for what was right. Now, all she could do was wait. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. His voice, steady and authoritative, cut through the tension in the room. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both sides," the judge began, his gaze shifting between Sophie and Daniel. "It is clear that the actions taken by Daniel and his legal counsel in this case were inappropriate. The will, as it stands, is valid. Sophie, as the rightful owner of the property, has every right to determine what happens to her estate." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a fight, had expected to be dragged through the mud, but hearing the judge's words felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. "The house in question," the judge continued, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him, "will remain under Sophie's name. The changes made to the will by Daniel, without her consent, are invalid. The estate is hers to control, and it is not to be contested further by Daniel or his wife." Sophie's heart swelled with relief, though it was tempered by the emotional toll of everything that had led to this moment. Daniel's face went pale as the reality of the judge's words sank in. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. Laura's eyes flashed with anger, her lips tight, but she said nothing. The gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing. Sophie stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of vindication, though it didn't come with the triumphant joy she had expected. She had won, yes, but what had it cost her? Her relationship with Daniel was in ruins. The pain of being discarded, of being treated like an outsider in her own family, lingered in her chest. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and filled with respect. "You did well, Sophie. We've got a good chance of seeing this through." Sophie nodded, but her mind wasn't on the case anymore. The courtroom had been a battlefield, but the real war was the one she'd been fighting within her own heart. Daniel and Laura stood to leave, their expressions cold and furious. Sophie didn't look at them. She had already made her peace. This was her life, her home, and no one, least of all her own son, was going to take it from her. As she left the courthouse, Sophie felt a strange calm settle over her. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, she felt a quiet sense of victory. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her strength, and her place in the world. The days that followed the court hearing felt strangely empty. Sophie's victory, though sweet, was not as satisfying as she had imagined. The house was hers, but the silence that had settled in her life was deafening. Daniel and Laura hadn't reached out to her since the hearing, and though Sophie knew she should feel relief, all she felt was a void, a space that had once been filled with love, now replaced with an unbearable emptiness. Sophie had won the house, yes, but the cost had been steep. The relationship with her son was shattered, perhaps irreparably so. She had spent years loving him, sacrificing her own needs for his well-being, and now it seemed like all of that was for nothing. The harsh truth was that Daniel had chosen Laura and their ambition over the woman who had raised him. Sophie couldn't help but feel that a part of her had been lost in that courtroom, something irretrievable. But Sophie was a fighter, always had been. She knew that she couldn't let the bitterness of this situation consume her. There was still so much life to live, so much she hadn't done yet. The house by the sea was more than just a symbol of her past. It was her future now. She wasn't going to let it become a monument to her pain. It was time to rebuild, time to move forward, even if that meant accepting the weight of the loneliness that hung over her. One afternoon, while walking along the beach, Sophie found herself standing at the water's edge, staring out at the vast expanse of the ocean. The waves rolled in steadily, their rhythm a constant reminder that life in all its forms moved forward. She had spent so much of her life looking backward, clinging to the past, to the memories of her late husband and the family she thought she could hold together. But now it was time to look ahead, time to create new memories, new reasons to smile. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Margaret. "Sophie, we've missed you. Come over tomorrow. We'll make dinner, talk about anything but the past." Sophie smiled as she read the message. Margaret had been a true friend, someone who had always been there when Sophie needed support, when everything else felt like it was falling apart. That evening, Sophie found herself sitting at Margaret's kitchen table, surrounded by the warmth of good food and even better company. They talked about everything, old friends, new hobbies, the things they had learned over the years. It wasn't the same as it had been when Sophie had shared everything with Daniel, but it was enough. The laughter of her friends, the sense of belonging, filled the space that had been so painfully empty just days before. As they chatted, Sophie found herself reflecting on the choices she had made. She had stood up for herself in a way she never thought possible. She had chosen to fight for her dignity, her voice, her life, and though the road ahead wasn't clear, though the wounds of the past still stung, Sophie knew that she had done the right thing. She had reclaimed what was hers, not just the house, but her strength, her sense of self-worth. The next morning, as Sophie walked back to her house by the sea, she noticed a small change in the way she moved through the world. She wasn't walking in the shadow of the past anymore. She was walking toward a future that was all her own. The house, the memories, the battles. They were part of her story, yes, but they didn't define her. What defined her now was how she chose to live, how she chose to move forward despite everything. Sophie knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt, but she was no longer afraid. She was not the woman she had been when the court case began. She had fought and she had won, not just the house, but the right to live on her own terms. And as the sun dipped low over the ocean, casting a warm golden light over the sea, Sophie stood on the porch of her house, finally at peace. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly breathe. The days continued to pass, each one a small victory in Sophie's quiet, determined march forward. As she spent her mornings walking the beach, her afternoons reading, and her evenings sharing dinner with her friends, Sophie began to feel a shift within herself. The past still lingered in the corners of her mind. The echoes of her son's betrayal and the anger she'd felt were not easily forgotten. But there was something deeper now, a quiet understanding that her life was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she was gaining. The house by the sea was hers. It always had been. It had been built with the love and hard work of Sophie and her late husband. And now it was a place where Sophie could reclaim her life, her sense of peace, and her independence. It had been a symbol of family once, but now it stood as a symbol of her resilience.